and welcome to Module 2 of these series of video lectures on cultural studies. We completed the first module, which we will do a quick recap. We recall that in Module 1, which was essentially an introduction to cultural studies, we devoted 2 lectures to understanding cultural studies. This entailed a definition of culture, of cultural studies. This entailed looking at the scope of cultural studies. This entailed looking at kindred fields like sociology, anthropology, and how these are different from cultural studies. And we looked at, the crux of cultural studies as, as a political practice, in the sense that one does cultural studies with a view to forming policies that would bring about change. So we did 2 lectures on understanding cultural studies, and then we, following Chris Barker, we argued that we cannot, it is not profitable, or it is not wise to leave out the scientific, the contributions from science, and we looked at evolution and culture. We looked at evolutionary psychology, and we recall the 5 principles of evolutionary psychology. We looked at the origins of the modern mind, okay, and we looked at an analogy between cultural transmission and genetic transmission using MIMS and comparing, or rather drawing the analogy from genes in the theory of memetics. Then we went on to look at 3 theoretical schools of cultural studies, with the caveat that there are other schools which we shall be dealing with when we look at look at other modules, because for instance, when you speak of gender, that's when feminism would come in as a theoretical school. So just to give you an example, okay, of how people theorize regarding culture, we took up these 3: structuralism, Marxism, and poststructuralism. Okay, so we devoted 10 lectures in Module 1, and quickly to look at what we did in the last lecture, that is on poststructuralism. We looked at this branch of philosophy called epistemology, and we said that epistemology is a theory of knowledge that looks into the origin or sources, the limits or the boundaries, and the state or status of knowledge. And we saw how this, going back to epistemology, is a key strategy in poststructuralism. We also looked at belief and knowledge, and we said that in cultural studies, or not in cultural studies only, in epistemology, belief is seen, or knowledge is seen as belief that has been justified. Okay, so belief by itself, very generally speaking, does not qualify to be knowledge unless it is justified. Then we saw that unlike structuralism, which looks at meaning as differential and relational, and yet says that there can be stable meaning, what happens in poststructuralism is that meaning, owing to the very argument of structuralism that meaning is differential and relational, poststructuralists hold that meaning is, on account of this, meaning is endlessly deferred. So there is what we call the impossibility of arriving at meaning in a final sort of a way. Okay, so meaning, owing to the fact that it is by reference to relations in a system, a meaning will always carry traces of other words in the whole differential system. So we looked at certain terms from Jacques Derrida, the French philosopher, and these terms are deferral, substitution, and supplementation. When transposed to cultural studies, we could say, following poststructuralism, that identity okay, is continually recreated, in the sense that identity is not stable as you would have it in structuralism, but identity is always a shifting and it is contingent. Okay. So, there is a provisionality of identity looked at from the post-structuralist point of view in cultural studies. Then we looked at Foucault and the important term discourse. We found that discourse gives has the power to name. Okay, discourse can create what we call a subject, and today's lecture will be devoted solely to subjectivity and subject position. Okay, so we talk about subjectivity in as the is a topic of the first lecture in module 2. Module 2, as you know, is devoted to key concepts. Well, culture as maps of meaning was seen under post-structuralism as achieving just a temporary stability through discursive practices, something that is not there once and for all. And we looked at later Foucault, who gives us a way around this problem. It's not that we are caught, we are slaves of these discourses, and he says in his later work that self-construction, reflection and reinvention are the very tools with which we can recreate ourselves. And then finally we saw that meta-narratives and global regimes give place to micro-narratives and local regimes. Well, now we come to module 2, and as I said, we are going to look at certain key concepts that go into, it is important for us to know these concepts. It's important for us to kind of lay them bare. It's important for us to talk about key concepts and to see how various practitioners, various theorists, various scholars have looked at these key concepts. So we find a heterogeneity of meaning and definitions, and it's important for us to look into them. Now, to begin with, what is a concept, or what are concepts? Well, we could say that concepts are ideas. Okay, concepts are ideas, and there is always a certain abstract quality about concepts. If a concept has to be applicable in different situations, if a certain kind, it cannot be too concrete, because a concept has to lend itself, okay, a concept has to lend itself to various situations. So a certain, as I said, a degree of abstractness is something that that a concept will always have. So concepts are seen as ideas and abstractions, and finally they are seen as units of knowledge or of meaning, right? So units in the sense that concepts become the building blocks of any knowledge system. In order to have knowledge, in order to be able to say something intelligible and further applicable to other things and situations, we would need concepts as the basic units or building blocks. Therefore, let's look at a few of the concepts that we shall be dealing with. In one, of course, is subjectivity. The other is representation. We also look at ideology. We look at power. We looked at power in post-structuralism and in the first 2 lectures in the last module. But we shall come back to it in a more detailed sort of way, and we look at identity. There may be a couple of other, as I deem fit, a couple of other concepts that I might bring in this module. Fine. So we know that our topic, the topic for today's lecture is subjectivity. Okay. What is subjectivity? Subjectivity is basically the process, or define it as a process of being and becoming for any person. Okay, being in the sense you are a person, but the fact that you are a person is not just a given for once and for all. Even if you look at yourself as a person who's arrived today, that person as there are certain processes. So here this word becomes important. becoming. There are certain processes that have gone into making you as a person. Okay, so for the time being, we define, at least as a beginning move, we define subjectivity as the process of being and becoming a person. Okay, and we'll look at this closely in the next few slides. Now, let's first take a quotation which was really so phenomenal, in the sense that it's so phenomenal in when it first came up. It was so striking. This is from the French philosopher Simone de Beauvoir and her book The Second Sex. The Second Sex obviously talks about women, and in that book, this is one of the most celebrated sentences in that book. She says, one is not born but rather becomes a woman. And look at this in a way sums up really what subjectivity is. One is not born but rather becomes a woman. You may think that, well, when a girl child is born, she is a woman. So how does she become a woman? Okay, in this whole process of becoming, see, this is a process, right? In this whole process of becoming, and in her study of this process of becoming, Simone de Beauvoir is telling us that there are outside of a woman. Okay, now this is in the case of feminism, but it applies everywhere. Outside of a woman, there are certain social and cultural processes that make a woman. Okay, so biologically one may be born with as a girl child, but the processes, so woman is not simply a sexual identity, it is a gender identity. Okay, so as a woman, one has a certain subjectivity, right? So and this subjectivity is not simply, as we saw earlier, look at not just a question of being, but it's also a question of becoming. Hence this, one is not born but rather becomes a woman. These are two terms. Well, we can also understand subjectivity vis-a-vis, or well, in opposition to objectivity. Okay, you'll understand that objectivity is usually given a lot of importance. Objectivity is seen to be a virtue, and subjectivity is not seen to be a virtue. Science, for instance, science till recently was seen as something objective, in the sense that if you are a scientist, you do not bring your inner world, your inner feelings, your inner experiences into the study of science. But no, today, especially after the uncertainty principle, especially after work done by so many philosophers like Bruno Latour, for instance, okay, you cannot say that you are completely objective as a scientist. Okay, so subjectivity becomes today very important, even, as I said, even in the study of science. Okay, and what goes on in the laboratory, right? So the observer, in observing a phenomenon, brings a certain picture into it. So subjectivity then, as I said, even in science and technology, okay, is a concept. It's a key concept that has come into understanding and revising our understanding of scientific practices. Well, I will quickly would like to look at this, further look at this, and this is from the Encyclopedia of Philosophy. The terms, now let's read this. The terms objectivity and subjectivity in their modern usage generally relate to a perceiving subject, that is a person, and a perceived or unperceived object. Let's look at it a piece. Objectivity and subjectivity is about perception. Okay, and who perceives a subject? That is normally talking about a person, a human being here. There is a subject that perceives, okay, and there is an object that you perceive. So it is a division that you create. I am watching or looking at or perceiving something else. Okay, it seems as if I am completely removed from that object. So the object is something that, see, look at this term here, presumably, the object presumably, we only presume that it exists independent of the subject's perception of it. In other words, the object would be there as it is, even if no subject perceived it. Okay? So in philosophy, for instance, we have this whole debate about, is there a world out there? Is there a reality out there, outside of our perception? Okay, there are so many views on this, so many opinions on this, so many theoretical, there are so many arguments about this. Hence, objectivity is typically associated with ideas such as reality, truth, and reliability. And we saw in our last lecture that this is a problematic issue, in the sense that reality, truth, and reliability as something being out there, outside of us, is a very contentious issue, right? Poststructuralism, remember, would say that it is, these are linguistic creations, right? We perceive the world as a particular subject through our discourses, and discourses are what? Discourses are, in the ultimate sense, these are linguistic exercises. Okay, so the point in bringing this here is that it is generally assumed that there is an object and there is a subject, right? And there is an objectivity about the object, which is there even if you are not looking at it. Derrida, then let's look at what Derrida says. Derrida says, and he acknowledges the importance of subjectivity and the subject. Derrida says, the question of the subject and the living who is at the heart of the most pressing concerns of modern societies. Okay, so the subject and the who is watching, okay, who is reading, who is perceiving. This today is at the heart of some of the most pressing concerns of modern societies. So we know that this is rendered a problematic issue, something which is a key concept, but on this concept, so many people have thrown light on it and are continuing to do so. So now there are three terms I want you to look at. When we say subject, okay, when we say, moment we say subject, there are kindred terms, Some people say a subject is a self. Some people say a subject is a human being, okay, or human nature. So these are terms that are related, okay, human, self, and subject. Now it is important for to us to look at the thin, differences among these terms. For instance, when you say human and when you say subject, what is happening? The difference here is, when we say human, we refer to universal, something unchanging nature. For instance, human nature. The moment we say human nature, we are, in effect, we are saying that there is something called human nature which is applicable to all human beings. Something that is unchanging, something that is universal. This is the kind of thing that deep structures from evolutionary studies would tell you. For instance, the 8 emotions that we have, right? And the strongest of them, fear, for instance, is part of human nature. Okay, there is no doubt that this sort of thing needs to be acknowledged. Of course, when you look at deep down and look at the deep structures, definitely there is something called human nature. But subject is not understood as human nature. There is a difference. Okay, so if human is universal, unchanging, subject is immanent and cultural. Okay, so it's important for us in the beginning to differentiate. Okay, when we will begin to talk about subjectivity, we are not going to talk about humanness or human nature in the universal. The next difference, again, as I had said, is between self and subject. Okay, many people would think that subjectivity and selfhood are interchangeable. I'd hasten to say that they are not exactly replaceable by each other. Okay, when we talk about self, it is held by many that self involves a certain interiority. Okay, it is about the interior, your interior, not exactly in the sense of intimate feelings, experiences. It's the inner world, so to speak. Okay, it's the inner world. But when we say subject, we have to understand that yes, it is about our inner world, but the onus or the focus is on culture. To be specific, it would be like this. The onus is on how does culture shape us as subjects, okay, which in turn gives us an interior world, right. So there are these very very subtle differences between human and subject, self and subject, okay. So we ought not in the beginning, these are different concepts. You see, self is a concept, human nature is a concept, and subjectivity is a concept. It is important for us to train ourselves to make these subtle divisions or distinctions among various concepts. Well, I'm again quoting from Chris Barker, and this is again to do with self versus subject. While subjectivity, you look at this, while subjectivity, he says, is a social and cultural accomplishment, our individuality, now there's another fourth concept we come across. So for the other concepts, one is subject, one is human or human nature, one is self, and finally a fourth one, individuality. So subjectivity is a social and cultural accomplishment, okay, and individuality is understood in terms of the specific ways in which the resources of the self are arranged. Each of us are culturally constructed, we are subjects, but we arrange them in certain ways, and that is why even though the cultural situations are the same, none of us is the same. All of our inner worlds, our inner feelings, experiences, etc., are the result of arrangements, okay, how the resources of the self are arranged, and that's so beautifully put here by Barker. That is, while, please look at the slide, that is, while we are all subject to the impress of history, the particular form that we take and the specific arrangements of discursive elements are unique to each individual, okay. For we have all had singular patterns, singular in the sense here of unique, okay, singular patterns of biochemistry, family relations, friends, work, and access to discursive resources, okay. So remember, subjectivity then is not, as Foucault said, remember later Foucault, subjectivity is not something that is impressed onto you once and for all, or it's not a one-way traffic, okay. We also arrange our resources according to, look at this final term here, according to the discursive resources that you have with you, okay. Another shade of meaning of subject, if you look at subject not as a noun, you look at subject as a verb, okay, in the sense of it would mean to be subjected to, mean to be subjected to, okay, in the sense of the way, you see, you talk about, in feudalism, you talk about, say, vassals as, or under kings in a situation of monarchy. We are the subjects and there is a king who is ruling us. The king rules over his subjects, in that sense, to be placed under, okay. As a verb, subjectivity entails to be placed under something. So, to be placed under, in our sense from cultural studies, now well, you've looked at discourse, you've looked at, you have looked at meaning, so it will be easy for you to understand this, okay. So, we are placed under certain regimes of discourse. Do you understand? Okay, so we are subjected to discourse. Another quotation here from Nick Mansfield, you can look up this very interesting book, Theories of the Self from Freud to Haraway. Is talking about how different theorists, psychologists and people from various fields have looked at the idea of self, okay. Mansfield says the word subject therefore proposes that the self is not a separate and isolated entity, but one that operates at the intersection, look at the words that I have given in bold and in red, operates at the intersection of general truths and shared principles. Look at the two words, general truths and shared principles. It means simply that these come from our social arrangements and from our culture. So, subject is not an isolated entity. You may have an inner world, but you have to understand where that inner world is coming from. is not solipsistic, is not an isolated, separate, being separate from social processes. Okay? So, subject is self that comes about through the operation of general truths and shared principles from our socio-cultural arrangements. Okay? Now, Barker, therefore, now as I said, we are going to look at various ways of looking at subject from different persons, from different scholars. So, in this case, Barker here, Barker looks at subjectivity in 3 dimensions. One is subjectivity is a condition of being a person. Subjectivity refers to the processes that go into the construction of the person. And Barker also includes the self part of it. Okay? He says subjectivity is not just the condition or the state of being of a person. Subjectivity is not just the processes. Subjectivity is also the very experience of being a person, that inner world that we are talking about. Okay? But the inner world not as isolated, the inner world in, in connection, okay, to culture. So, subjectivity is the condition of being a person, the processes that go into the making of the person, the construction of the person, and it is the very experience of being a particular person. So, again we bring in Foucault here, okay, and let's look at these 6 points from Foucault. A. Foucault says there are no universal subjectivities. There cannot be a subjectivity that is common to all of us in all senses of the term. There can be no universal subjectivities. All of our subjectivities differ. And remember why? Because we also contribute in the arrangement of the resources of the self, as we saw a while ago. Second, subjectivity is an effect of discourse. Okay? Remember we saw in our last lecture, we looked at the term discourse, and we said that discourses are regulated ways of speaking about something. And we, if you recall, we took the example of man. When we say man, there are various discourses that try to define man, so to speak, to pull man into their own discursive field and to pin man down, okay, down with their own terminologies. For instance, religion is one discourse that would define man in a way very different from some other resource, from other discourse. For instance, psychology or psychiatry, economics, for instance, politics, for instance. So all of these, so to speak, have a stake really in defining and delineating the boundaries of what any entity is. So subjectivity therefore is an effect of discourse. So if you have a subjectivity as a religious person, okay, your subjectivity, that is your experience and your constructedness as a religious person, is an effect of the discourse of religion. Do you follow? Now that has made you, in another sense, it has subjected you to the discourse of religion. Okay? Now if you are an atheist, a person who does not believe in God, in the existence of God, your position, your condition, and your experiences as an atheist, okay, are determined by the discourse of atheism. Right? So you are, so to speak, in that sense subjected, in the narrow sense. In this case, this is a one-way traffic. You are to be completely subjected. But we also know that there is another aspect to it, is that the discursive practices or the discourses that you have, that you know of, they of course do go into the making of your subjectivity. But remember, we also arrange in the manner of later Foucault, we also arrange our subjectivities according to the resources that we have. And that's why I would think that it is good to inhabit as many discourses as you can, so that you do not fall prey to any one discourse. Okay? Coming back to the slide, the subject therefore may be defined as a discursive formation. Okay? A subject or one's subjectivity is an effect of discourse, and it is a formation by discourse, and hence it is a discursive formation. So this next point we have also already taken up. Discourse also subjects people to its rules. Okay. So, they remember what is a discourse? Discourse is a rule bound linguistic activity, in the sense that it's a regulated way of speaking, remember. So, there are certain rules, you cannot go outside of those rules. So, if you are subject to its rules, then the subjectivity of people is a result of operating within those rules. Next, it gives us subject positions. So, we will look at this a while later. Discourse subjects us, creates us, constructs us, gives us certain experiences, and it gives us subject positions or perspectives through which we make sense of this world. Okay? Therefore, subjectivity is historically and culturally constructed. Barker then comments. We've just seen what Foucault says about discourse and subjectivity, and let us read Barker's comments on Foucault. Okay? Barker says, Foucault attacks what he calls the great myth of the interior. Now, the interior, remember, the self, the interiority. Okay? Foucault says that it is a great myth. It is a myth to think that you have an interior that is isolated, okay, that is separate from any other thing, that is sort of so sacrosanct to yourself, on which nobody has access, or on which for the formation of which nobody has contributed. So, Foucault attacks what he calls the great myth of the interior, arguing that the subject is a historically specific production of discourse. Okay? Not just, you are produced by a certain discourse. That discourse also has the imprint of history. It's important to ask at which point in the historic moment, the moment in history has, what is the condition of that discourse in that moment of history. For instance, religion. Religion is a discourse which has changed from time to time. Okay? Religion, there are people who have brought in reforms in religion. Well, the main precepts may be the same, or rather the main belief in a God, in a supernatural being may be the same. But we know, for instance, the Bhakti movement in Hinduism. The Bhakti movement brought in another aspect. The Arya Samaj movement, for instance, brought in another way of looking. So, at any historical moment, then the discourse is historically specified. Okay? So, let's read it again. Foucault attacks what he calls the great myth of the interior, arguing that the subject is a historically specific production of discourse with no transcendental continuity. Okay? There is no transcendental in the sense of, something that is sort of, in all time, something that is extra to historical and temporal and spatial considerations. There is no transcendental continuity from one subject position to another. Then, to speak, Barker here again, to speak is to take up a pre-existent subject position and to be subjected to the regulatory power of that discourse. This is Barker commenting on Foucault, as we know. In this conception, the speaking subject is not the author. This is very important. When you speak, you think that you are the author. When you write, when somebody writes, you recognize him or her as an author. Okay? Foucault says not so. Right? The speaking subject is not the author or originator of a statement. Okay? You look at, this is a very important point. The speaking subject, the one who speaks, is actually not the author of his thoughts, not the author of his sentence. Okay? Nor is he the originator of the statement. When you say a statement, you think that, well, it is my statement, I have uttered it, I have said something. But Foucault would say no. I would say, I as a subject feel something and I am saying something. He says, no, you're not only are you not the author of what you're saying, you are also not the originator of anything that you say. Why? Because it depends on the prior existence of discursive positions. Discourse has already given you the words, the terms, the sentences, the feelings, name it. Okay? So, whatever statement you are saying, however new it may sound to you, is dependent, as it says, on the prior existence of discourse. Okay? You cannot speak outside of discourse. Even if you bring two discourses together, you are still speaking from the existing structures of discourse. Now, these subject positions can be filled by virtually any individual when he formulates the statement. So, where is the concept of agency here? In a strict sort of way, if you look at the point being made here, any person can say what you are saying. Any person, these subject positions, this position rocking from a certain position, this position need not be you. It could be filled by any person, virtually any individual when he formulates the statement. So the famous, let's say, argument that discourse is everything, in this way, it does make a lot of sense. Okay, so you speak from pre-existing discourses, and so you are not really the author of what you are saying. Okay. Now let's look at this. And in so far as one and the same individual may occupy in turn the same series of statements, different positions, and assume the role of different subjectivities. Okay, there is also, if you inhabit different discourses, you can speak from different discourses. In that case, you will have different subject positions. Okay, according to postmodernism, this would be a very liberatory condition. Okay, that you can hop from one discourse to another and not be stuck. Here, remember, it is because you are seen as somebody who is subjected to a discourse. Okay, so there are times when you should, according to this theory, you should be able to occupy in order, to release yourself from discourses. In short, as Barker says, in short, the process by which we are constituted as subjects is one in which we are subject to social processes that bring us into being as subjects for ourselves and others. Okay, others are watching us as we make certain statements from certain discourses. That's the way they are judging us, and you're doing the same for the others. Okay, so we are subject to social processes that bring us into being. Okay, see, processes is a state of becoming which gives you the being, okay, as subjects for ourselves and others. Now, I would like to point to a quotation from Black Skin, White Masks, and you have heard of Frantz Fanon, who, look at this quotation from Black Skin, White Mask. Dirty nigger, or simply, look, a Negro. Fanon says, I came into this world anxious to uncover the meaning of things. My soul desirous to be at the origin of the world. And here I am, an object among other objects. Okay, so just before this, if you look at this quotation here, look at this, that bring us into being as subjects for ourselves and others. Okay, the other who is looking at you, judging you, okay, for him or her, you are the object, right? The person is watching you, you are is judging you, you are a subject of study for that person. And this process of being both a subject and an object is so beautifully put by Frantz Fanon, and this is the dilemma of anyone in an oppressive situation. Be he or she a Dalit person, be he or she a woman in certain circumstances, or be he or she a black person, okay, or a Hispanic, in North America, for instance, okay. So there is always a feeling for the Hispanics, let's not name anyone in a situation of oppression, okay. That person, following Fanon, okay, that person, look at this, is anxious to uncover the meaning of things. That person has a subjectivity of his or her own. His or her soul or spirit is desirous, wants to be in the origin of the world, wants to make meaning. And then he says, well, when somebody calls me a dirty nigger or a Negro, I understand then that I have become an object for the other person. The subjectivity of that person is cancelled out in the sense that that person now begins to think that my subjectivity is something that is being made by another person. What we call the gaze of the other. My other, the white man, is now telling me who I am. Whereas I have an inner world, I have a subjectivity which an interiority, so to speak, it uses the word my soul, interiority, that also wishes to be the at the origin of meaning, at the origin of the world, right? So I am being made an object by somebody. We then look at Judith, another very seminal theorist as far as gender studies is concerned, and gender trouble being one of her one of her most celebrated works. Now Judith Butler says this: if there is something right in Beauvoir's claim, remember Simone de Beauvoir and her book The Second Sex, published in 1949, I think. Okay, so Butler says, if there is something right in Beauvoir's claim that one is not born but rather becomes a woman, it follows that woman itself is a term in process. Okay, why? Remember, if you go back to the earlier slides, we had one slide in which we said that subjectivity is, being a subject is a process, right? It's a cultural process. So she says that if Beauvoir's claim is correct, that we become a woman, we are not simply born a woman with all our, behavioral patterns established from the day we are born, she says that it logically follows that woman itself as a concept here, okay, as a term, the term woman itself is a term in process. It is not a given once and for all. Okay, what it means to be a woman is something that is still in process. The meaning of which, to use a Derridan term, is deferred. Okay, the meaning is deferred, and it differs from other things in the system. The meaning of woman as a concept is deferred. Follows that woman itself is a term in process, a becoming, not a being, an essence given once and for all. A becoming, a constructing that cannot rightfully be said to originate or to end. Well, it is as a process. There is no originary moment of womanhood. There is no end. Okay, as a process, it's a process without a beginning and an end. Why without a beginning? Because we do not know. And why without an end? Because it is a process that is always and will always change. Okay, let's read it again. If there is something right in Beauvoir's claim that one is not born but rather becomes a woman, it follows that woman itself is a term in process, a becoming, a constructing that cannot rightfully be said to originate or to end. As an ongoing discursive practice, this is very important. It is open, the term woman is open to intervention and re-signification. Okay, we have highlighted these terms, right? If it is a process, then we can intervene. If somebody tells you this is what a woman is, it is not a process of becoming, it's one of being, something that is a given. This is what a woman is, or this is what a woman should be. We can, because woman is a discursive, it's a discourse, okay? It's a discursive practice, it's put into practice. We can intervene, right? We can sort of butt in and we can intervene and we can say that, well, this is not woman. Woman is much more than this, or woman is very different than this. Okay? The moment I say woman, I am sure you are not going to think about a woman truck driver. Are you going to think about a woman truck driver? You are not going to think about it. Okay? So you have to intervene, and next you have to re-signify. Okay, so as an ongoing discursive practice, the category woman is open to intervention from our side, and it is open to re-signification. It is in a signification process. No, we have to, because it is a process, re-inscribe woman. We have to make it, to re-signify the whole processes. If need be, dismantle other older signifying or processes of signification. Okay, so I think this is a very important contribution from Judith Butler. There's so many other points from Butler, but the intervention and re-signification possible when we look at woman and woman's subjectivity as a process, right, that is open to resignification and intervention, right. Therefore, these are these terms now which will come in our understanding of subjectivity. Okay, one is agency. We think of ourselves as subjects, right. Now let's look at just a sentence, from a grammatical point of view. You know that a sentence can be in a very elementary way divided into what? Two parts, a subject and a predicate, right. A subject, the predicate part of a sentence is what is said about the subject. For if we say Rahul threw the ball, okay, when we say Rahul threw the ball, then Rahul is a subject who is performing an action, that is a verb to throw, and the object is the ball, right. So there is a certain agency, a certain doingness, okay, the subject as a doer, right. So you feel that as a subject I have agency, as a subject I have free will, okay. The point here is that it is not so simple as it looks. It's not just a grammatical sentence we are talking about. How free are we? Okay, again an essential question from philosophy. How free are you and I, okay, to do things, and how far are things determined, right? So as a subject, our free will and our agency are our idea of complete free will and complete agency is an illusion. So also we would argue from cultural studies that complete determination, okay, complete determination from social cultural processes also is an illusion. Remember Karl Marx. What did Marx say? Marx said that the relationship between the base and the superstructure, your relationship between the your social your consciousness and your which comes from social processes, economic processes, and your action, these are there is a certain there is a certain agency to it. But the point is, remember in our lecture on Marxism we found that history has already given us, so it is determined in the sense that there is the impress of history, okay, but there is a will in us, okay. So even in cultural studies, it is understood as a play between determination on the one hand and agency and will on the other. Okay? So our subjectivity is a result of determinate forces, and at the same time there is we have the freedom to make arrangements. Okay, arrange our resources. Right? Yes. Therefore, Barker says in Making Sense of Cultural Studies that the constitution of the subject as conceived by cultural studies is cultural studies thinks of the subject as a discursive construction, proposes that we are cultural and political agents, and what is required is the capacity for switching between these languages as appropriate and according to our purposes. This gives us the freedom from complete determinacy. Okay? Therefore, the three disciplinary discourses, now coming quickly back to Foucault, okay, which work through power, which is generative and productive of subjectivity, are the sciences, which constitute the subject as an object of inquiry, okay, the technologies of the self, whereby you and I turn ourselves into subjects, and the dividing practices which separate the mad from the sane, the criminal from the law-abiding citizen, and friends from enemies. Now, this I will take up in detail, okay, since we don't have time here, in detail in my lecture on power, and we shall talk about this generation of subjectivity and these three disciplinary discourses. Okay. Therefore, quickly ending this lecture here, subject position means this, that a discourse creates a subject and subjects the subject to discourse, and the reader or the agent occupies a position from which the world makes sense through the specific discourses. Therefore, the subject position is a function of discourse. Okay? So, orientation, placing, obligation, and foregrounding. These are, you know, certain terms which you can replace subject position with. And rather, subject position may be seen as orientation, placing, obligation, and foregrounding. Okay. Now, quickly I would like to skip a few points which need not be in this lecture, take it up elsewhere, or let's we go to the discussion and we look at how, first question, how is subjectivity seen in relation to personhood? Subjectivity is seen as both a process, process and an essence, as being and becoming. Okay, and we say becoming is more highlighted here. How could we differentiate between concepts of self and subject? Self refers to a certain interiority and subject is cultural. How does Chris Barker define subjectivity? As a condition, it is a process, and it is an experience of being a person. Okay. Then we looked at Foucault's understanding of subjectivity as an effect of discourse and a discursive function, and discourse also subjects us, and subjectivity is historically and culturally constructed. So the three disciplinary discourses, which I said I'll take up later, quickly are the sciences, technologies of the self, and the dividing practices. And finally, Judith Butler. What does Judith Butler, what does she have to say about subjectivity? When we take up women's subjectivity, she says that one, following Beauvoir, becomes a woman, and therefore woman is a term in process. Okay, and finally, the good news is we can intervene and we can re-signify what woman means. Okay, so today we have looked at subjectivity as a key concept, and there will be other concepts that we shall be looking at. Of course, these are not the only things, and we can't really pack subjectivity into one lecture. But my hope is that I have been able to, make a differentiation between subject and human, and self on the one hand, and also to be able to show you how cultural studies argues that subjectivity, okay, or our experience of being a person, is neither a given and nor is it something stagnant. That you can also recreate or reinvent yourself, and if you can manage your subjectivity by managing the resources of the self, and kind of put your own individual unique stamp on it. Okay, so thank you very much. The next lecture we'll be doing would be something coming from subjectivity, something related to it, and that would be identity. Thank you so much.